The noon train arrived at Redstone Crossing 12 minutes late, which was the usual for September when the heat made the rails expand, and the engineer had learned over 20 years of service that pushing iron through a Texas summer was an argument nobody won. The platform had already gathered its crowd. Cattlemen waiting on freight. A preacher in a black coat mopping his neck with a handkerchief. 3 women from the Methodist Church who had come for a delivery of hymnals and stayed, as women in small towns often do, because something in the air felt worth watching. The sky above the station was white with heat, the kind of white that had no softness in it, and the dust that rose from the street beyond the platform hung there without moving, as though even the wind had given up. The train exhaled. Steam poured from beneath the wheels in long, slow sighs, and the crowd shifted forward the way crowds do when they have been waiting too long, and patience has curdled into something closer to impatience. Trunks were unloaded. A crated rooster announced its displeasure. A boy of about 7 broke free from his mother and ran to the edge of the platform until she caught him by the collar and pulled him back without looking up. Nobody paid particular attention to the woman who stepped down from the second to last car. She came down the iron steps carefully, one hand on the rail, the other hand occupied with the strap of a single carpet bag that had once been burgundy and was now the color of old brick after rain. She wore a dress of blue calico, the kind of blue that had been washed so many times it had gone pale and soft as old paper, and the fabric moved gently with her as she stepped onto the platform. Her hat was small and dark, a traveling hat, practical rather than pretty. And beneath the narrow brim, her face was composed in the particular way of someone who has been composing it for a very long time. She was 28 years old. She looked older in the eyes. The hand holding the carpet bag strap wore no ring. At the left side of her hat, tied just above the brim, was a narrow ribbon of black grosgrain. She stopped at the bottom of the steps and stood still for a moment, one hand still resting on the iron rail as if she was deciding whether to let go of it. The platform noise continued around her. The rooster, the voices, the hiss of steam. She was breathing slowly and deliberately, the way a person breathes when they have been sick for a long time, and breathing has become something that requires attention rather than something that simply happens. Her name was Nora Sutcliffe Hale. She had traveled 1,800 miles to stand on this platform, and she had done it in 5 days, sleeping in a wooden seat in the second-class car, eating what she could afford from station vendors, keeping her face turned to the window in the dark hours when the other passengers were sleeping, and she was not, watching the country change from the gray stone of Pennsylvania to the flat ochre of West Texas, thinking about the man who had placed the advertisement in the Pittsburgh Courier 4 months ago, thinking about what she would say when she met him, thinking about the future, the way people think about a door they are about to open in a house they have never been inside. She had not known, when she wrote her reply to that advertisement, that she was pregnant. By the time she understood what the morning sickness meant, she had already received his response. By the time she was certain, she was already committed. And by the time she could have chosen differently, she had sold everything that was sellable, including the thin gold band that Edmund had placed on her finger in the spring, and she had nothing left to sell and nowhere left to go. And so, she had come here. She had told herself the whole way here that she would explain everything when she arrived. She had told herself that a reasonable man would understand. She had told herself a great many things across 1,800 miles of railroad track. She let go of the iron rail. He was already watching her from across the platform. Douglas Hargrave was a large man in the way that prosperous men in prosperous counties often became large, wide through the chest and stomach, wearing good wool in the September heat because good wool was what a man of his standing wore, regardless of temperature. He had a rancher's face, weathered and definite, the face of a man accustomed to making assessments and expecting those assessments to be final. He was 47 years old, and he had decided that a mail-order wife was a reasonable and efficient solution to the problem of his household, and he had approached the matter the way he approached all matters of commerce, with specificity and an expectation of receiving what he had paid for. He walked toward her, and the crowd parted for him without being asked. That was the kind of man he was in Redstone Crossing. He stopped 3 feet from her and looked at her the way a man looks at livestock he is considering purchasing. Her face, her hands, and then lower. The expression that crossed his face was not anger. Not yet. It was something colder than anger. Something that lived further back in a man's chest. A combination of disgust and calculation that was somehow worse than rage would have been. "Show me your face," he said. And even though she had already lifted the brim of her hat, even though he could already see her perfectly clearly, she understood that the command was not really about her face at all. The platform noise did not stop exactly, but it diminished. The women from the Methodist church had stopped talking. The cattleman had turned. The boy with the rooster had gone still. "Mr. Hargrave," Nora said. Her voice was even. She had practiced even. "I need to explain something to you. There are circumstances that I should have written to you about, but I did not know them when I wrote, and by the time I understood them, it was already." "You are pregnant," he said. The words fell on the platform boards like something dropped from a height. The women from the Methodist church pulled their shawls tighter in the September heat, which made no practical sense, but was a gesture the body makes when it wants to close itself off from something. "I am," Nora said. "My husband died in February. There was a collapse at the mine where he worked, and I did not know until afterward that I did not order a widow with a child on the way," Hargrave said. He said it the way he might read back an incorrect invoice. Factual. Categorical. Impossible to argue with because argument implied there was a question involved. The advertisement was clear. You answered it, knowing you could not fulfill what it asked. "I answered it in good faith," Nora said. "The situation changed after—" "The situation is what it is," he said. He reached into the breast pocket of his good wool coat and removed a bill, folded once, and he dropped it on the platform boards between them. Not pressed into her hand. Dropped. As if even the transaction of placing money in her palm was more contact than she was worth. $5 lay on the gray platform wood. The preacher looked away. The cattlemen suddenly found their freight very interesting. The Methodist church women were very still and very quiet. Nora looked at the bill on the boards. She looked at it for the length of 3 breaths, which was how long it took her to understand that there was no version of this moment that was not going to be what it was. She had come 1,800 miles. She had $5 in her shoes. She was 5 months pregnant, and she was standing on a platform in a town where no one knew her name, and the man she had traveled to marry had just dropped money at her feet the way you drop a coin to a beggar when you don't want to be slowed down. She bent to pick it up. The motion was awkward. Her center of gravity had shifted in the last weeks, and she had to widen her stance and lower herself carefully. One hand on her knee for balance, and the carpet bag swung forward on its strap and the whole thing was slow and effortful and visible to every person on that platform, and there was nothing she could do to make it less so. She straightened. She folded the $5 bill and placed it inside the carpet bag. "Damaged goods," Hargrave said, and the contempt in those 2 words was complete. "Go find yourself another arrangement. I won't be taking on another man's mistake." He turned and walked back across the platform, and the crowd parted for him again, and he passed through it and was gone. The steam from the train had thinned. The platform noise resumed around Nora as if someone had turned a valve and let the ordinary sound of the world flow back in. The women from the Methodist church began to move. The cattlemen turned back to their freight. The preacher adjusted his hat and walked in the direction opposite from the one where Nora was standing. Nobody came to speak to her. She stood very still with the carpet bag in her hand and the $5 bill folded inside it, and the sound of the town filling in around her, and she did not cry. She was very precise about not crying. Crying could come later. Crying could come in whatever room she found for herself, in whatever boarding house would take the $5 and what remained in the bottom of her shoe, and the skills that she had, which were modest but real. And she would figure out the rest because she had been figuring out the rest since February, and she had not stopped yet. She was thinking all of this, which is how she did not notice for a moment that there was a man standing against the far wall of the station building who had not moved through any of it. He was leaning with one shoulder against the weathered board wall, arms folded loosely, hat pulled low against the midday glare. He was perhaps 32, with the kind of face that the Texas sun had worked on steadily for years, weathered without hardening, the way good leather weathers. His hands were visible even in the folded position, rough with callus and work. The hands of a man who did not sit at a desk. He wore a plain gray shirt and a vest the color of dust and the boots of someone who spent most of their hours on their feet rather than in a saddle. He was watching the space where Hargrave had been standing, and then he was watching Nora. He did not look away when she noticed him. Most of the people on that platform had found reasons to look elsewhere within 30 seconds of Hargrave dropping the money. This man had not found that reason or had not looked for it, and there was something in the steadiness of his gaze that was different from spectacle, different from judgment. It was closer to witness, the kind of looking that said, "I see what happened here. I see all of it. And I am not going to pretend that I don't." He pushed off from the wall. He crossed the platform with a deliberate pace, unhurried, moving with the steadiness of someone who has already decided what they are going to do, and the decision is behind them now. And what remains is simply the doing. "That is enough," he said. He said it to the empty air where Hargrave had been standing, which was a strange thing to say to the empty air, but Nora understood that it was not, in fact, addressed to the empty air. It was addressed to the moment itself, to the fact of what had just happened on this platform in front of all these people. He was naming it. He was putting a line under it and saying, "This is where it stops." He stopped 2 feet from her, close enough to speak at a reasonable volume without the remaining bystanders overhearing. He touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, which was the greeting of that place and that time, but the way he did it was careful and deliberate, a gesture that said, "I know what courtesy looks like, and I am offering it to you on purpose." "Ma'am," he said, "my name is Brent Calloway. I run a cattle operation about 4 miles west of town." He paused. Are you all right?" Nora looked at him for a moment. She had spent 5 days on a train deciding who to trust and how much, and she had arrived at the conclusion that the answer was as little as possible and none if she could manage it. And here was this man with his work-roughened hands and his careful distance and his question. And the question was so straightforward and so devoid of anything except simple human inquiry that she found she did not have an immediate answer. "I will be," she said. He nodded, as though that was a satisfying response, as though someone saying "I will be" rather than "I am" was information worth having, a sign of a particular kind of person. "Is there someone in town you know? Somewhere to go?" "No," she said. "Then let me walk you to Mrs. Briggs's boarding house. It's on Caldwell Street, 2 blocks from here. She's a fair woman. She won't ask you things that aren't her business." He reached out and lifted the carpet bag from her hand before she had quite decided whether to let him, not with force, but with the quiet efficiency of someone who has made a practical assessment and acted on it. "Consider it a loan," he said, because she had already opened her mouth to refuse. She closed her mouth. They walked off the platform together through the thinning crowd, and Nora noticed that he introduced her to no one, explained nothing to no one, and kept a measured distance between them, near enough to walk with her in the way that said she was not alone, far enough to make clear that he understood the difference between companionship and claim. She noticed that he helped an old man retrieve a dropped parcel without breaking stride. She noticed that the livery owner on the corner raised a hand in greeting, and Brent returned it briefly, without stopping. She noticed that the women who had been on the platform were watching from across the street, clustered in the way people cluster when they are deciding what story to tell later, and Brent did not look at them at all. It was 2 blocks to Mrs. Briggs's boarding house on Caldwell Street. They walked it in something close to silence, which ought to have been uncomfortable, and was not. The boarding house was a 2-story structure of white-painted wood that had gone a little yellow at the edges where the paint had aged unevenly. A porch ran the length of the front, and 3 clay pots held geraniums, still red in September, which meant someone was watering them faithfully. It was not large. It was clean. There were curtains in the windows. Nora stood on the front step. Brent knocked. The woman who answered the door was perhaps 60, with white hair that she wore in a neat bun at the back of her neck, and the direct gray eyes of someone who had lived long enough to have formed opinions and short enough on patience to let you know it. She was English. It was in the architecture of her vowels when she said yes, and the particular set of her shoulders that suggested she had been expecting something slightly better from the day and was prepared to accept what she had received. Her name was Edna Briggs, and she had run this boarding house for 11 years, and she had seen a great many things arrive on her porch and had developed a reliable sense for what each thing required of her. She looked at Nora. She looked at Brent. She looked at the carpet bag. "Room at the back," she said. $2 a week, includes breakfast and the use of the kitchen Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Dinner is extra." She stepped back to let Nora through, and then looked at Brent over Nora's head with the specific look of a woman who wants to convey several things efficiently and without words. Brent reached into his vest pocket and placed money on the small table just inside the door. 2 weeks, he said. "I'll be back Tuesday." "No, you won't," Mrs. Briggs said pleasantly, "because you'll leave her to settle in without hovering." He accepted this without visible offense. He set the carpet bag inside the door and touched his hat brim once more, this time to Mrs. Briggs, and he turned and walked back down the porch steps and down the path to the street. Nora watched him from the doorway. There was a moment before he turned the corner at the end of Caldwell Street, and she saw it from behind. The particular quality of his walk, unhurried and deliberate. A man who had done what he came to do, and was neither proud of it, nor in need of acknowledgement for it. Just a man walking back to his life. Mrs. Briggs put her hand on Nora's arm, light and brief, the way a person touches something fragile to test whether it is as fragile as it appears. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." Nora stepped across the threshold. The room at the back of the house was small and clean, with a window that looked onto a yard where a vegetable garden had been recently turned for the coming autumn. There was a bed, a washstand, a chair, and a small writing table with a candle holder. The floorboards had been swept. Someone had laid a braided rug beside the bed that was the color of autumn leaves, red and gold and brown, ordinary and worn and quietly beautiful. Nora sat on the edge of the bed and set the carpet bag on her knees. She was quiet for a long time. Then she opened the bag and removed, from between two folded pieces of clothing, a small ledger bound in dark cloth. The cover was worn at the corners, and the spine had been repaired with a strip of brown leather that did not quite match. She held it in both hands and looked at it the way people look at things they are not sure whether to be glad or sad about keeping. Edmund's handwriting was on the first page, small and careful, the handwriting of a man who had not had much schooling but had taken the schooling he got very seriously. Columns of numbers, dates, the names of suppliers, the careful record of a man who had worked in the mines for 8 years and had noticed, in the last months of his life, something in the numbers that did not sit right. In the middle of the book, folded twice to fit between the pages, was a single invoice. It was from a hardware supply company. It listed quantities of timber and iron supports. At the bottom of the page, in the blank space where additional notes were sometimes written, Edmund had written 2 words in red ink. She had found it only 2 weeks after he died, when she was going through his things. She had carried it with her ever since, not because she understood it, but because Edmund had written it in red, and Edmund only wrote in red when he thought something was important. She smoothed the invoice with her thumb. Insufficient supports. Outside the window, the yard was still and golden in the September afternoon. Somewhere down the street, a door closed. A horse moved past at a walk, the soft thud of hooves on packed earth. And then it was quiet again, and Nora sat on the edge of her borrowed bed in her borrowed room in a town she had arrived in 2 hours ago. And she looked at her dead husband's handwriting, and she thought about what it meant to have come this far and still have further to go. She did not know yet what those 2 words would do. She did not know yet that the man who had carried her bag down Caldwell Street was carrying his own version of insufficient supports, his own ledger of losses, his own reckoning written in the margins of a life that had not turned out the way he had planned. She did not know that Douglas Hargrave had known the name of that hardware supply company for a long time. She did not know, sitting in that small clean room, about the version of her own story that Redstone Crossing would tell for the next 30 years, the story that began on a train platform in September and ended differently than anyone standing on that platform could have predicted. She did not know that the $5 bill folded inside her carpet bag would become, in the telling, both the lowest point of her life and the hinge on which everything afterward turned. She did not know any of it yet, because the story was not yet a story. It was just her life, happening to her, one moment after the next, in the way that lives happen before they become the things people tell. What she knew was more modest and more essential. She knew how to read a ledger. She knew that numbers told the truth if you asked them the right question. She knew that Edmund's handwriting was careful and that careful men did not write in red ink without a reason. She knew that she was not going to die on the floor of this borrowed room, though she had felt on the platform the specific way the ground seems to tilt beneath you when everything you planned turns out to be wrong. She had felt that tilting, and she had not fallen, and that was something worth knowing about herself. She knew that a man named Brent Calloway had walked across a platform toward her when no one else had moved, and that he had done it with the deliberate, unhurried quality of someone who had already decided and was simply completing the decision. She did not know what that meant yet. She was too tired and too newly arrived to know what it meant. But she had noted it, the way she noted everything, carefully, in order, with attention to what each entry might mean when placed beside the others. She knew that somewhere 4 miles west of this room, a ranch sat under the September sky with sound fences and a kept yard and the quality of a place that someone had refused to give up on. She had seen it in the way he carried himself, the particular dignity of a man who has absorbed loss and kept going, not because the going was easy, but because stopping was not something he had been built for. She knew that her child was alive inside her, moving at intervals with the mysterious purposefulness of someone who has places to be, and that this child would be born into whatever she managed to build between now and then, and that what she managed to build depended on what she did next. And what she did next depended on the numbers in the ledger and the invoice in the middle of the ledger, and the 2 words written in red ink by a man who had believed, with the stubbornness of a careful person, that real things eventually mattered. She would make Edmund write about that. She did not know how yet, but she was going to make him write about that. All she knew in that small, clean room on that September afternoon was that she was still here. That was, for the moment, enough. The first thing Nora learned about Redstone Crossing was that it was a town that ran on observation. Not gossip, exactly. Gossip implied malice, and most of what moved through Redstone Crossing moved without any particular cruelty behind it, the way water moves through a channel, simply because the channel is there and the water has to go somewhere. People noticed things. They mentioned them. The mentions traveled from the dry goods store to the barber shop to the church steps to the kitchen tables of the better houses on Maple Street. And by the time a piece of information completed that circuit, it had acquired the status of established fact, regardless of what it had started as. Nora had been in town for 4 days when Harriet Voss stopped her on the sidewalk outside the hotel. Harriet Voss was a woman of 55 who wore her gray hair in a style that had been fashionable in 1865, and wore it still with the conviction of someone who had decided that fashion was for people with fewer opinions. She was not unkind. She was simply precise, in the manner of people who have lived in small towns long enough to understand that precision is a form of economy, and economy is next to godliness. "You are the Hargrave woman," she said. It was not a question. "I am Nora Hale," Nora said. Harriet looked at her for a moment. "You are the Hargrave woman who is no longer the Hargrave woman," she corrected, and from that point on, Nora existed in the town story with that particular designation, which was accurate, if not entirely flattering. Mrs. Briggs had mentioned to Brent Calloway on his first visit, which came not on Tuesday, as he had announced, but on Monday morning before breakfast, that the woman in the back room had skills with numbers and was looking for work. Brent had said that the Redstone Hotel kept their accounts in a state that would give a reasonable person a headache, which was a fact he knew because he had helped pull their books straight 2 winters ago when the owner's arthritis had gotten bad enough that he could no longer hold a pen. He had mentioned this to the hotel manager the following afternoon in the course of conversation, and the hotel manager, whose name was Grover Finch, and who was a practical man of 40, had sent word to Mrs. Briggs the same evening. Nora started work on the Wednesday. The accounts were in exactly the state Brent had described. Finch had been doing his best with the ledgers since his previous bookkeeper had left in June to follow his wife's family to Colorado, and his best was earnest but not accurate. There were columns that did not balance, expenses recorded in the wrong quarter, supplier invoices filed under names that appeared to be a private coding system Finch had developed and then partially forgotten. Nora sat at the small desk in the back office and worked through it methodically, the way she had learned to work through her own chaos in the months after Edmund died. 1 page at a time, 1 entry at a time. The discipline of numbers being that they did not change based on how you felt about them. She was 2 days into the work when she found the first irregularity. It was small. A supplier payment recorded twice, once in the main ledger and once in a secondary record that appeared to be Finch's overflow notebook when the main ledger was full. The amounts were slightly different, not much. $3.40. The sort of discrepancy that could be an error, that almost certainly was an error, except that when she looked further back, she found it had happened before. Different amounts, different suppliers. The same pattern of duplication with slight variation. She noted it in pencil on a separate sheet of paper and continued working. She did not mention it to Finch. She was not yet sure what she was looking at, and she had learned in Pittsburgh, at some cost, the difference between being sure and being certain, and she did not intend to make that mistake again. Brent came by the boarding house on Wednesday evening with a bottle of milk and the explanation about the cow, which Nora had already decided she was not going to interrogate further because the milk was cold, and she had been wanting cold milk since Amarillo, and arguing with kindness seemed like a particular kind of waste. "How was the work?" he asked, from the porch steps where he had sat down without being invited, which was presumptuous in a way that somehow was not. "Manageable," she said. She was in the chair nearest the porch rail with her feet up on the lower rail, which was not particularly ladylike, but Mrs. Briggs had told her privately that she could do what she liked on the back porch, as long as she did not do it on the front porch where Harriet Voss could see. "Finch is a good man," Brent said. "He just doesn't have the head for it." "Nobody should have to have the head for their own accounts," Nora said. "They should just do the accounts, and the accounts should come out right." Brent looked at her sideways. "You sound like someone who has had this argument before. I had it with my husband for 3 years, she said, and the sentence came out more naturally than she expected, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And then the moment settled into something that was not uncomfortable. "What did he do?" Brent asked. Not what did he do for work. What did he do? As if Edmund were a complete person and the work was only a part of it. "He was a miner," Nora said. "In Pittsburgh. He was good at it. He understood rock the way some people understand horses. He could look at a seam and tell you things about it that the engineers couldn't." She paused. "He kept notes on everything, numbers, observations. He said if you don't write it down, it doesn't exist." Brent was quiet for a moment. He turned the milk bottle in his hands. "Sounds like a careful man." "He was," Nora said. The evening was cooling slightly, the way September evenings in Texas eventually, reluctantly cool after the indignity of the day's heat, and somewhere down the street a door closed and a lamp was lit in a window, and the small, ordinary sounds of a town settling in for the night moved through the air between them. Iris liked numbers, Brent said. He said it in the careful way a person says a thing they are testing the weight of before they commit to putting it down. She was better with them than I was. Better with most things than I was. Iris. Nora had been waiting for that name since Mrs. Briggs had mentioned, in passing and without detail, that Mr. Calloway had lost his wife some years back. She had been waiting for it the way you wait for a thing you know is coming without knowing exactly when. She did not ask anything. She understood by now that Brent Calloway was a man who said things in his own time and in his own sequence, and that questions interrupted the sequence in ways that were hard to recover from. So she simply let the name sit there between them in the cooling evening and waited. He did not say anything more about Iris that night, but he came back on Friday with eggs and on Sunday with a small square of cornbread wrapped in cloth that he said his neighbor had made too much of, which was so obviously not true that Nora almost said so, and then decided that the cornbread was good and the fiction was harmless, and some kindnesses worked better when you agreed not to examine them. On Sunday afternoon, old Silas Greer, who ran the livery stable on the eastern end of Main Street, brought a horse in from his far pasture with a deep cut on the near foreleg that should have meant the end of the animal's working life. Nora was crossing the street when she saw Brent crouched beside the horse in the entrance of the livery, one hand steady on the horse's halter, talking to it in the low, even tone a person uses when they need something frightened to stay still. He worked on the leg for the better part of an hour, cleaning it and wrapping it with the focused patience of a man who has decided the horse is worth the time, regardless of whether anyone else agrees. She did not stop. He did not see her, but she saw him, and it went into the accumulating record she was keeping, the way she kept all her records, carefully, in order, with attention to what each entry might mean when placed beside the others. Thursday morning brought trouble, as Thursday mornings in Redstone Crossing had a tendency to do. Nora was walking to the hotel from the boarding house, which was a distance of 6 blocks along Caldwell and then right on Main Street, a walk she had made every morning that week without incident. The morning was still cool, the sky the particular pale blue of early September before the heat gathered itself for the day's work. And she was thinking about the secondary ledger and the pattern of duplications, and whether what she was seeing was an error or a system when Douglas Hargrave stepped out of the door of the saloon. The saloon did not open until 10 o'clock in the morning, which meant that whatever he had been doing in there before 10 o'clock had not been conducted under the saloon's official hospitality. His eyes had the quality of a man who had not slept well and had found something in the absence of sleep that agreed with his worst instincts. He looked at her, and the disgust on his face was the same disgust she had seen on the platform, unmodified by the passage of 2 weeks, as fresh and definite as it had been the first time. "Still here," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Hargrave," Nora said, because she had decided that she would be polite to this man regardless of what it cost her, because politeness was the one thing he could not take from her, and she intended to keep it. "I had to write to the agency," he said. He moved slightly, not quite blocking her path, not quite not blocking it. Told them the first woman they sent was unsuitable. Had to explain why. That was an embarrassment I did not need. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Nora said, which was not entirely sincere but was entirely polite, and she moved to step around him. His hand closed on her arm. Not hard, exactly, but definite. The grip of a man who was accustomed to things staying where he put them. You think because Calloway decided to play at being decent that you have some kind of standing here, Hargrave said. His voice was low and even, which was somehow worse than if he had shouted. You don't. You are a woman with no husband, no family, no money, and a child coming that nobody in this county is obligated to care about. Whatever you think you're building here, it's built on nothing. Nora looked at his hand on her arm. She examined it with the same precise attention she brought to the ledgers. She noted it. She filed it. Then she looked up at him. Let go of my arm, Mr. Hargrave, she said. Her voice was even. She had spent years making her voice even. Something shifted at the edge of her vision. Brent Calloway was crossing the street from the direction of the feed store, which was on the opposite side of Main, walking with the deliberate steadiness she had come to recognize. He stopped beside them. He did not touch Hargrave. He did not raise his voice. He stood where he stood and looked at the hand on Nora's arm, and then looked at Hargrave's face. And the quality of that look was not threatening in any theatrical sense. It was simply completely steady. The kind of steady that costs something to maintain and is maintained anyway. Hargrave held the look for 4 seconds. Then he released Nora's arm and stepped back. Mind your affairs, Calloway, he said. I generally do, Brent said. Hargrave walked away down Main Street, and his walk had the quality of a man who is leaving because he has chosen to, and not for any other reason. And both Nora and Brent watched him go until he had turned the corner by the bank, and then the street was ordinary again. Brent did not ask her if she was hurt. He looked at her arm briefly, and then looked at her face with a question in his expression, and she gave him a small nod that meant I am fine, and he accepted the nod. He will come back, he said, not as a warning, as information. I know, Nora said. He always comes back. He said it as someone who has personal knowledge of a specific pattern rather than a general understanding of human behavior. He came back at my father 3 times over 8 years. Every time my father wouldn't sell him the western pasture. My father died before he ran out of patience, which was the only thing that saved the land. Nora looked at him. And now? Brent's jaw moved slightly. Now I owe back taxes on that pasture. 2 years of them. Hargrave knows it because Hargrave has a friend on the county assessor's board, and the assessor's board knows everything it's useful to know if you have friends there. He said it without self-pity. He said it the way he said most things, as a statement of what was true, offered without ornament. The taxes, Nora said. How much? He told her. It was not an impossible amount. It was not a small amount. It was the kind of amount that would not disappear on its own and would grow with interest into something worse if it was not addressed in the next 4 to 6 weeks. She thought about the pattern of duplications in the hotel's secondary ledger. She thought about the supplier names that appeared in both the hotel's accounts and in the invoice folded inside Edmund's ledger. She was not yet ready to say what she thought she was looking at, but the shape of it was becoming clearer, the way shapes become clear in poor light when you stop trying to see them directly and let your peripheral vision do the work instead. That afternoon, Brent went to see Sheriff Lorne Peck. Nora knew about it because Mrs. Briggs knew about it because Mrs. Briggs knew about everything that happened within 4 blocks of Caldwell Street within approximately 2 hours of its happening. a capability Nora had stopped trying to understand and had simply accepted as a feature of the house. "He filed a complaint," Mrs. Briggs said, setting a cup of tea on the small table beside Nora's chair with the efficiency of a woman who communicates important information and useful beverages simultaneously. "Against Hargrave, for what happened this morning on Main Street." Nora looked up from Edmund's ledger. "Sheriff Peck told him Hargrave has a lawyer from Denver on retainer," Mrs. Briggs continued, "and half the town council having dinner at his house on a regular basis." She sat down with her own tea. "Brent told him he had the truth and the intention to use it." "That's either very brave or very impractical," Nora said. "In this town," Mrs. Briggs said, "it's usually both." She looked at Nora over her cup. "The hearing is set for 5 days from now. Judge Aldrich comes through on the 3rd Thursday of every month." Nora looked back at the ledger. The candle beside it was burning low, and the light moved slightly in a draft from under the windowsill, and the numbers on the page shifted in the moving light, becoming fluid and suggestive rather than fixed and certain. She thought about what it would mean: a hearing, a public proceeding. Hargrave's lawyer from Denver sitting across a courtroom from a cowboy with no lawyer at all except the truth and the intention to use it. She turned to a fresh page in her notebook and began to write. The night was quiet around her. The town had settled into sleep. The last horses had stopped moving through the streets, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the boarding house adjusting to the change in temperature, and the scratch of her pen moving across paper, and the distant, indifferent sound of the wind coming through from the open plain to the west. She wrote for 2 hours. When she finished, she had 3 pages of notes in her small, careful hand, organized by date and by source, and by the question each entry raised and whether that question was answerable from the existing evidence or required further investigation. She had learned this system from a woman in Pittsburgh named Mrs. Garfield, who had run the accounts for a shipping company for 20 years and who had told Nora on her first day of work there that numbers were only as useful as the questions you asked of them. "Ask the right question," Mrs. Garfield had said, "and the numbers will always tell you the truth." The right question, Nora now believed, was not whether the duplications in Finch's hotel ledger were errors or deliberate. She was increasingly certain they were deliberate. The right question was whose deliberateness they represented, and whether the answer to that question connected to the other question she was carrying, the one Edmund had written in red ink at the bottom of an invoice from a hardware supply company, the one she had been carrying for 8 months across 1,800 miles of railroad track without yet knowing exactly what to do with it. Insufficient supports. She closed the ledger. She was 5 months pregnant and exhausted in the deep, bone-tired way she had learned was not the exhaustion of a day's work, but the exhaustion of a life that had been running on necessity for a long time, and she needed to sleep. But before she lay down, she sat for a moment in the chair by the window with the dark outside and the candle behind her, and she put one hand flat on her stomach, which had become a habit, a kind of checking in, a way of reminding herself what the point of all of this was. The baby moved under her hand, not a kick exactly, more like a shift, a rearrangement, as though the small person inside was finding a more comfortable position for the night. "I know," Nora said quietly, to no one in particular. "I'm working on it." She did not yet know what it would cost her, the working on it. She did not know about the envelope that would arrive the following evening, pushed under her door without a knock, without a return address, containing a single folded page with an old accusation on it and a handwritten warning at the bottom in ink so dark it had nearly cut through the paper. She blew out the candle. Outside, the wind moved through Redstone Crossing in the way of winds that have come a long way across flat country and have picked up nothing on the way, clean and indifferent and carrying the faint smell of dry grass and the enormous dark, and the town lay under it, quiet and ordinary, the way towns lie at night when they are keeping their complications for morning. Under Nora's door, in the dark of the hallway, an envelope slid through the gap and landed silently on the floorboards. She was already asleep. She did not hear it, but it was there, white against the dark wood, waiting with the patient certainty of things that have been sent and cannot be unsent, for the morning to come, and the light to find it, and Nora's eyes to open, and the next part of everything to begin. The envelope was there when she woke. She saw it before she saw anything else, white against the dark floorboards, precisely where the gap under the door met the edge of the braided rug. The morning light was thin and gray and early, the kind of light that arrives before it is fully committed to the day. And in that light, the envelope looked both ordinary and deliberate, the way things look when someone has placed them rather than left them. Nora lay still for a moment and looked at it from the bed. Then she got up. The single page inside was from a Pittsburgh court file. She recognized the format. She had seen that format before, had held a copy of it in her own hands 8 months ago in a clerk's office in Pennsylvania, while a man behind a counter told her in a voice of complete administrative neutrality that the charges had been dismissed, but that dismissal was not the same as expungement, and the record would remain accessible. She had understood then what accessible meant. She understood it again now, holding the page in a boarding house in West Texas in the early morning, with her carpet bag still sitting under the small writing table, and the sound of Mrs. Briggs beginning to move in the kitchen below. At the bottom of the page, below the printed text, someone had written in dark ink, with a hard, pressing hand, "Leave before the hearing. This is the only notice you will receive." Nora folded the page. She folded it exactly as it had been folded before and placed it back inside the envelope and set the envelope on the writing table beside Edmund's ledger. She stood at the window and looked at the yard where the vegetable garden had been turned for autumn, the dark soil ordinary and patient in the early light, and she breathed in and breathed out and let the initial cold wave of it move through her and pass. Then she went downstairs to breakfast. She did not mention the envelope to Mrs. Briggs. She ate her eggs and her toast and drank 2 cups of tea and listened to Mrs. Briggs describe a dispute between the Methodist Church and the Presbyterian Church over the scheduling of a shared community supper that had apparently been ongoing since 1879 and showed no signs of resolution. And when breakfast was finished, she walked to the hotel and opened Finch's ledger and went back to work. She worked steadily through the morning. She did not work faster than usual. She did not allow the envelope's existence to change the quality of her attention, because her attention was the one thing she had that was entirely her own, and she had learned to guard it. By midday, she had added 2 more entries to her notebook. The pattern was no longer a suspicion. It was a structure. Brent came to the boarding house that evening later than usual, when the sky had already gone to the particular dark rose of a Texas sunset, and the first lamps were being lit along Caldwell Street. He had been out at the ranch all day, which she could tell from the honest heaviness in the way he moved. Not the exhaustion of a bad day, but the settled weight of a day's physical work completed. He sat down on the porch steps with his hat in his hands, and she brought out 2 cups of coffee because Mrs. Briggs had made a fresh pot, and because the evening was cooling and she was learning the vocabulary of small practical offerings that meant something without requiring words to carry the weight. He looked at the coffee and then at her. "You found something else," he said. She had not said anything. She had simply sat down with her own cup. "How do you know?" she asked. "You sit straighter when you're carrying something you haven't said yet, like you're keeping something from tipping over." Nora considered this. It was accurate. She had not known it was visible. She told him about the envelope. He was very still while she talked. Not the stillness of someone who had stopped feeling, but something closer to a man holding a full glass and walking carefully across a room he knew had uneven floors. When she finished, he said nothing for a long moment. "You're going to the hearing," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He turned his hat in his hands. "1 full rotation." "Then I need to tell you something." He looked out at the street. "Iris marked something in my father's land records before she died. I found it after, but I didn't understand what I was looking at. I'm starting to think maybe you would." Nora set her cup down. "Show me." He brought the records the following morning, a folder of papers worn soft at the folds from being handled, tied with a piece of twine that had been retied so many times it had lost its original tension. She spread them on the writing table and went through them the way she went through everything, systematically, in order, with the pencil moving across her notebook, in the small, careful hand that Mrs. Garfield had called the most useful handwriting she had ever seen because it was legible under pressure. Iris had marked 3 entries, not with words, with a small precise mark in the margin, a single line, vertical, that could have been a printer's error except that it appeared in exactly the same position on all 3 pages and was made with the same pen. The 3 entries were land transfers. Each one recorded a parcel sold under assessed value, each with a different seller, each to a different purchasing name. But the dates of recording were spaced at intervals of almost exactly 4 months, and 2 of the purchasing names shared an agent, and that agent's name appeared in Finch's secondary ledger as an authorized signatory on 2 of the duplicate payments. Nora put her pencil down. "Your father didn't sell to Hargrave directly," she said. "No," Brent said. He refused every time Hargrave asked. "He sold to someone who then transferred the title." She looked up. "Did he know?" Brent's jaw moved. "My father was not a sophisticated man when it came to paperwork. He trusted the agent because the agent had been in Redstone Crossing for 20 years and had handled land business for half the county." He paused. "He died thinking he had never sold an acre to Douglas Hargrave." The room was very quiet. Outside, a cart moved along Caldwell Street, the wheels loud on the packed earth. And then it passed, and the quiet resumed, and in the quiet Nora could hear her own breathing, and Brent's, and the small sounds of the house settling in the morning warmth. "Iris knew," Nora said. "She knew something was wrong," Brent said. "She was trying to work out what. She was better at that kind of thinking than I was. I told her not to trouble herself about it." His voice went flat on that last sentence in the way voices go flat when they are containing something that would be very loud if it were not contained. 3 weeks later, she got sick. He did not say anything further about that. He did not need to. The hearing was the following morning. Nora did not sleep well. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the boarding house at night and thought about Pittsburgh. and about the clerk's office, and about the particular kind of exposure that came from having your past read out in a room full of people who had already formed an opinion of you. She had survived it once. She would survive it again. But surviving and being unafraid were not the same thing, and she had long ago stopped pretending they were. She brought Edmund's ledger to the courthouse. The courtroom was the largest room in the county building, which was not large, and it was full. Redstone Crossing had opinions about Douglas Hargrave and opinions about Brent Calloway, and even stronger opinions about the woman who had arrived on the noon train 2 weeks ago and had apparently decided to stay. And all of those opinions had generated enough curiosity to fill every available chair and most of the standing room along the back wall. Hargrave sat at the front with his lawyer, a man named Whitfield who had come up from Denver and wore a suit that cost more than most of the people in the room made in 3 months. He had the specific confidence of a lawyer who has won in smaller rooms than this one and expects to win again. Brent sat beside Sheriff Peck on the other side of the aisle. He had no lawyer. He had what he had told Peck he had, and it was what it was. Nora sat in the second row. Whitfield went first. He was efficient and thorough, establishing the facts of Hargrave's standing in the community, his tax contributions, his employment of local workers, his 30 years of residence in Redstone County. Then he produced the Pittsburgh record. He read it aloud. He read it in the measured, carrying voice of a man who understands that the way information is delivered shapes how it is received. And he let the silence after each sentence do the work that commentary might have done less effectively. Nora sat with her hands folded on Edmund's ledger in her lap and looked straight ahead and kept her breathing even. When Judge Aldrich turned to her, she stood. She had thought about what she would say in terms of what was necessary and what was not, in terms of what the evidence supported and what it did not. She was not going to defend herself with emotion. She was going to defend herself with precision, because precision was what she had. She explained the Pittsburgh situation clearly and without embellishment. The employer, the discrepancy she had found, the accusation that followed, the dismissal of the charges. She said it all in the same even voice she had used with Hargrave on Main Street, because it was the same voice, the voice she had built and maintained, and was not going to abandon now. Then she set Edmund's ledger on the table. She did not say it was evidence. She said it was documentation. There was a difference, and she let the difference do its work. She explained the hotel accounts and what she had found there, slowly and specifically, in terms anyone in the room could follow, because she had also learned from Mrs. Garfield that the worst thing you could do with numbers was make them complicated when they were not. The pattern was not complicated. It was simple. Someone had been removing small amounts of money from the hotel's accounts using duplicate entries, and the name of the authorized signatory on those entries appeared in the same documents as the land transfers Iris Calloway had marked in the margins of a land record 3 years ago. The room was very quiet. Harriet Voss, in the third row, had stopped fanning herself. Judge Aldrich looked at the ledger for a long time. He looked at Whitfield. He looked at Hargrave, whose face had undergone a significant rearrangement during the last 4 minutes. "The court will take a recess," Judge Aldrich said. "The matter of financial irregularity, as described by Mrs. Hale, will require separate investigation. The original matter of assault is addressed." He looked at Hargrave directly. "Mr. Hargrave, What happened on Main Street on Thursday morning was assault regardless of your feelings about the woman involved, her history, or her circumstances. This court issues a formal warning. Any further physical contact or harassment will result in immediate detention. Are we clear? Hargrave said nothing. Mr. Hargrave. Clear, Hargrave said. The word came out with the sound of something that had cost him considerably to produce. Outside the courthouse, in the long afternoon light, the crowd dispersed in the way crowds disperse when they have been given something to talk about for the next several weeks. Harriet Voss walked past Nora without stopping, but let her hand rest briefly on Nora's arm as she passed. The same kind of touch Mrs. Briggs had used on the doorstep of the boarding house 2 weeks ago, light and brief and saying what it needed to say. Brent was beside her on the steps. You knew all of that, he said. Before today. I knew the shape of it, she said. I wasn't certain until I put it together with your father's records. He nodded slowly. He was looking at the street, at the people moving through it, at the ordinary afternoon proceeding with its ordinary business, as though nothing particular had just happened in the room behind them. Iris would have done the same thing, he said quietly. Exactly the same. Nora did not say anything to that. She understood it was not a comparison, or not only a comparison. It was a recognition, something being seen and named. They walked back through town in the late light, and the evening came on around them in the gradual Texas way, the heat easing fraction by fraction, the sky moving through its sequence of colors. And when they reached the boarding house, Brent sat on the porch steps as he had before, but this time he did not immediately say anything, and neither did she. And the silence between them had changed its quality. From the silence of 2 weeks ago, had become less careful, less provisional, more like the silence between people who have stood in the same place together and are not required to explain what they saw there. After a time he said, "Come with me tomorrow. There's something I want to show you." She went. They rode out in the early morning before the heat gathered, Nora on the calm old mare that Mrs. Briggs kept for guests who needed to get somewhere further than walking distance, Brent on the gray gelding she had seen him ride past the boarding house twice since she arrived. The land west of town opened as they left the last buildings behind, wide and spare and golden in the early light, the grass moving in the small wind that came off the plain, and above it all the sky that Nora had been looking at since she arrived and had not yet stopped being surprised by, enormous and blue and so present it felt like something you were inside rather than something above you. The ranch came into view over a low rise, a collection of buildings in brown and gray wood, modest and functional, with a main house and a barn and several smaller structures arranged in the practical relationship of working buildings to each other. The yard was neat. The fences were sound. It was the property of a man who had not given up on it, even when giving up might have been easier. They left the horses at the paddock fence and walked around the side of the house to where the land opened again behind it, a wide sweep of grass running down to a dry creek bed and then rising again to the distant line of a ridge. And then he turned left, toward a small rise set back from the house, where 2 wooden crosses stood in the grass. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The crosses were simple, made from good wood, cut and fitted with care. The grass around them had been kept clear, not recently, but over time, the kind of maintenance that happens habitually because the person doing it cannot imagine not doing it. On the left cross, carved in letters that were precise and even, was a single name, Iris. The one beside it was smaller, It had no name, just the upright and the crosspiece, and the wood grain moving through both. Brent stood very still. Nora watched him stand there, and she understood, looking at his back, at the set of his shoulders, at the way his hands had moved from relaxed to pressed flat against his thighs, that he was experiencing something that had not diminished in 3 years, and was not going to diminish further simply because he was standing next to a person instead of standing alone. Some things did not diminish. They became more manageable with time, which was not the same thing at all. After a long moment, he folded at the knees and crouched in the grass, one hand braced against the earth, and his head dropped forward slightly, and his shoulders moved once, a single, involuntary movement, the kind that happens when something you have been holding in place slips its moorings for a moment before you catch it again. But this time, he did not catch it. His shoulders moved again, and then again, and then the contained thing inside him did what contained things do when they have been contained too long, and he made a sound that was very quiet and very raw and completely unlike the man who had stood on the courthouse steps 2 hours ago and said, "This is where it stops." Nora sat down in the grass beside him, not close enough to crowd, close enough to be there. She did not speak. She did not say the things people say, the things that are meant kindly and land sideways, because there are no words that are the right size for a thing this size. She simply sat in the grass with him and let him be where he was, which was what she had needed, herself, in the worst of it. Not solutions and not comfort, but presence. The plain, ordinary presence of another person who was not pretending the thing was smaller than it was. After a time, his breathing steadied. He sat back in the grass and looked at the crosses for a while. And then he said, "I was in the north pasture, chasing 2 steers that had gone through a gap in the fence. I was gone most of the day." His voice was quiet and level in the way of voices after emotional storms, cleaned out and without inflection. By the time I got back, the fever had been in her for hours. She couldn't tell me how many. The baby came early. Neither of them. He stopped. "I should have fixed that fence the week before," he said. "I knew it needed fixing." Nora looked at him. "You couldn't have known." "No," he said, "but I knew the fence needed fixing." She understood that these were not the same thing to him and were not going to become the same thing simply because someone said so, and she did not try to make them the same thing. She understood guilt the way she understood numbers, as something that had its own logic and responded to that logic and not to argument. "Edmund told me the morning he left for his shift," she said, "that the collar of his work shirt was fraying, and would I look at it that evening? I said I would." She looked at the crosses. "I never looked at it. I kept thinking I would get to it, and I didn't, and when they brought him home, I looked at the collar, and there was still the loose thread I hadn't pulled." She felt Brent look at her. "That's not your fault," he said. "No," she said, "but I still see it." They sat together in the grass in the quiet of the morning. The wind moved through at intervals, and the grass moved with it. And above them, the enormous Texas sky proceeded with its usual indifference. And it was all right, somehow, all of it. The grief, and the guilt, and the 2 crosses, and the one without a name, and the 2 people sitting in the grass who had each come to this particular hillside with their particular version of the same weight, because they were not alone with it. And that was different from being rid of it. But it was something. And sometimes something was what you had. They were on the walk back to the horses when he said it. Iris. She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, his hands in his pockets, his voice carrying the particular quiet of someone saying a word they have been deciding whether to say. If it's a girl, he said. The name. Nora stopped walking. She looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And in the silence, the wind came through again off the plain, and the grass moved all at once in a long golden wave, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark made its brief, declarative sound, and was quiet again. Yes, she said. He nodded. He put his hands back in his pockets and kept walking. That evening, she was at the writing table with Edmund's ledger open when she found it. She had been going through the supplier invoices one more time, cross-referencing against the secondary ledger in the way she had been doing all week, and she was on the third to last page when the name of the hardware company stopped her. She had seen it before. She had seen it in Edmund's ledger, on the invoice with the red ink notation. She had seen it and registered it and set it aside as a coincidence because coincidences existed, and she had tried to be disciplined about not seeing patterns where there were none. But now, in the hotel's supplier records, the same company name appeared not once, but 4 times over 18 months, with payments routed through the same intermediary agent whose name appeared in the land transfer records Iris had marked, and in the duplicate payments from Finch's secondary ledger. Nora sat back. The candle beside the ledger bent in the draft from the window, and the shadows shifted on the wall, and in those moving shadows she sat very still and understood something she had been circling for weeks without being willing to look at directly. Edmund had written insufficient supports. Edmund had worked in a mine operated by a company that had financial connections to the same network of shell agents and routed payments that appeared in Douglas Hargrave's land operations in Redstone Crossing, Texas. She did not know yet what that meant. She was not going to say what it might mean until she knew more. But she knew what it felt like when a pattern stopped being a coincidence, when the numbers stopped being ambiguous and started telling a specific truth. And she knew that feeling because she had learned it from a woman in Pittsburgh who had told her that the numbers will always tell you the truth if you ask them the right question. She closed the ledger. She sat at the window for a long time, her hand on her stomach, the town quiet around her, and the dark plains stretching out beyond the last lights of Redstone Crossing. Tomorrow she would show Brent. Tomorrow she would tell him what she thought she was looking at and what it might mean, and they would decide together what to do with it, because she had stopped, somewhere between the courthouse steps and the hillside with the 2 crosses, thinking of this as something she was navigating alone. But she would tell him tomorrow. Tonight she sat with it quietly, giving it the space it required before the space closed in around it, and it became something to act on. Tomorrow. She would tell him tomorrow. But when tomorrow came, Brent Calloway was gone. His horse was not in the paddock. His saddlebag was not on the hook beside the barn door where Mrs. Briggs said he always left it when he came to town. There was no note at the boarding house, no message with Sheriff Peck, no word left with old Silas at the livery stable, who had seen him ride out before dawn heading east and had thought nothing of it because men who run cattle operations often ride out before dawn heading wherever the work requires. East. Nora stood in the street outside the livery and looked east, where the road ran straight and pale through the morning toward the distant low hills and the railroad line, and beyond that, toward a country she had come from and he had no reason to visit. She stood there for a moment, Then she turned around and walked back toward Caldwell Street and the boarding house and the writing table with Edmund's ledger on it. And her jaw was set and her hands were steady, and she was thinking, in the focused way she thought when she had decided something, about what she was going to do next. She was not going to wait. She was not built for waiting when there was something to be done. She gave him 1 day. That was the agreement she made with herself, standing in the street outside Silas's livery, with the morning sun already pressing down on the back of her neck and the road running east into the pale distance. 1 day. Not because she owed him patience. Not because she was willing to simply wait while events continued to build around her like water rising in a room with no door, but because she was a fair person and fair people gave 1 day before they decided what a disappearance meant. She went back to the hotel and worked through the morning. She was precise and thorough, and she did not make errors because she never made errors when it mattered. And the work moved through her hands in the reliable way that work moves through the hands of people who have long understood that having something to do is one of the few genuine mercies available to the living. At noon, Harriet Voss appeared in the doorway of Finch's back office. Nora looked up. Harriet was not a woman who appeared in doorways without reason. She was a woman who went where she intended to go and said what she had come to say and left again, a quality Nora had come to appreciate because it was a quality she recognized in herself. "May I sit down?" Harriet said. It had the grammatical structure of a question and the delivery of a statement. "Please," Nora said. Harriet sat down in the chair across the small desk and folded her hands in her lap and looked at Nora with the gray eyes that had been assessing things in Redstone Crossing for 30 years. "I owe you an apology," she said. Nora waited. "When you arrived, I said things about you. To people. In the way that I do." Harriet paused. "I said them because that is what I do when I do not know something, and I am not comfortable not knowing it. And that is not a good reason, and I am aware of it." She unfolded her hands and refolded them. "You stood up in that courtroom and said what was true in a room full of people who were expecting you to be ashamed of it, and I have been thinking about that since yesterday afternoon." "Thank you," Nora said. She meant it simply, without elaboration, because Harriet was a woman who would find elaboration suspect. "I also have something to give you." Harriet opened the small bag she carried and removed a folded piece of paper. She set it on the desk between them. "Those are the names of 3 men who sold their land to Hargrave's agent in the last 2 years. I know those men. I know what they were offered, and I know what the land was worth. And I know that the difference between the two was not negotiable because they were told it wasn't." She looked at the paper. "I should have done something about it sooner. I didn't because I told myself it wasn't my business, and that was not true. It was everyone's business. I just didn't want the trouble." Nora picked up the paper. 3 names, addresses, dates of sale, amounts. She looked at Harriet Voss and she thought about all the forms that courage took and how few of them looked the way courage was supposed to look and how many of them looked exactly like this. An older woman in a good dress sitting across a desk and saying, "I was wrong and I should have done something, and here is what I have." "This helps," Nora said. "Good," Harriet said. She stood. "I understand Calloway has gone somewhere. I don't know where, but I would not have taken him for a man who runs." "No," Nora said. "Neither would I." Harriet left. Nora sat with the list of 3 names and added them to her notebook on the page she had started the night before. and the shape of what she was looking at became more complete, the way a picture becomes complete when you add the final pieces and stand back and see not parts, but the whole of what they make together. That evening, Douglas Hargrave came to Mrs. Briggs's boarding house. Mrs. Briggs answered the door and told him the house was not receiving visitors at this hour, and Hargrave told Mrs. Briggs that he had business with her tenant that would take 5 minutes, and would she prefer he conducted it on the porch, or would she prefer he came back with the county assessor and a list of building code violations that had been accumulating since 1878. Mrs. Briggs let him in with the expression of a woman who is filing the exchange away for future reference at a time of her choosing. He came into the small sitting room off the front hallway. Nora was already there, standing beside the writing table with her hands at her sides. He was sober. That was the first thing she noticed. He was wearing the good wool coat, and his face was composed in the manner of a man who has decided that the situation requires him to be careful, and careful required sobriety, and so he had been sober and was being careful. It was, in some ways, more unnerving than his previous appearances. He sat down without being asked. "I will be direct," he said. "Please," Nora said. "You have created a problem for me." He said it without heat, in the tone of someone describing a logistical difficulty. "The investigation the judge called for will turn up things that are complicated to explain. Not impossible, but complicated and time-consuming and expensive." He looked at his hands, then at her. "I would like the complication to go away." "I imagine you would," Nora said. "I am offering you a resolution." He reached into his coat and placed an envelope on the side table. "There is money in there. Enough for you to travel to wherever you were going to go before you came here, and enough to establish yourself when you arrive. It is a fair amount. More than fair." Nora did not look at the envelope. She kept her eyes on his face. "In exchange," he continued, "you withdraw the financial information you presented to the court. You tell Judge Aldrich that you made an error in your analysis, that the pattern you identified was a misreading of the records and not an intentional irregularity. You leave Redstone Crossing within 48 hours. He paused. "And Calloway's tax debt disappears. The assessment is corrected. He keeps his land." The room was very quiet. Outside, the evening sounds of Caldwell Street moved past the windows, ordinary and unhurried, the sound of a town that did not know what was happening in this sitting room and would not know until it was over. Nora looked at him for a long moment. "If I don't agree," she said. Something shifted behind his eyes, just slightly. "The tax assessment against Calloway's Western pasture has a deadline of Monday. Today is Thursday. If the assessment stands, the county will move to seize the land at the start of the following week." He said it gently, which was the worst way he could have said it. "And I have additional documentation from Pittsburgh that was not presented in yesterday's hearing. Mrs. Hale, a woman in your position, expecting a child alone, with your history following you, in a town where you have been here less than a month." He let the sentence remain unfinished. Some sentences are more effective unfinished. Nora looked at the envelope on the table. She thought about what was in it. She thought about what Monday meant for the land 4 miles west of town where 2 wooden crosses stood in the grass. She thought about the 48 hours and the road out of Redstone Crossing and the places she might go and what she would do when she got there. And the child who would be born in several weeks into whatever circumstances she had managed to construct by then. She thought about Edmund's ledger. She thought about Iris's small vertical marks in the margins of a land record. She thought about Harriet Voss sitting across the desk and saying, "I should have done something sooner." She put her hand on her stomach. The baby moved under her palm, the shifting rearrangement that had become as familiar as breathing, and Nora felt it and stood straighter, the quarter-inch straighter that happened without her deciding to, the way her body knew before her mind caught up that there was only one possible answer to this. "No," she said. Hargrave looked at her. "No to the money," she said, "and no to withdrawing the documentation, and no to leaving." She kept her voice even. She had built that voice over years, and it was solid. "What I told the court was accurate. What I found in those records is what I found. I did not misread it, and I will not say that I did." Hargrave stood. The gentle quality went out of his face, and what replaced it was the older thing, the cold, hard assessing thing she had first seen on the platform when he looked at her over her own damaged goods, and it was worse than anger, and always had been. "You are making a very significant mistake," he said. "Mr. Hargrave," Nora said, "I have been making significant mistakes by other people's definitions since February. I have found that I survive them." He left. Mrs. Briggs appeared in the doorway approximately 4 seconds after the front door closed, which meant she had been standing in the hallway for the duration of the conversation, which Nora found she was entirely grateful for. "Well," Mrs. Briggs said. "Yes," Nora said. "Sit down," Mrs. Briggs said. "I'll put the kettle on." Nora sat down and found that her hands were shaking slightly, which she had not allowed them to do while Hargrave was in the room, and which was now apparently making up for lost time. She looked at them and breathed in and breathed out and let the shaking run its course, because there was nothing else to do with it. She was not going to wait for Brent Calloway to come back and solve this. She was not built that way, and she had never been built that way. And the fact that she was 28 years old and 5 months pregnant in a town where she had been for less than 3 weeks was not going to change the fundamental architecture of who she was. In the morning, she went to see the lawyer. His name was Fletcher Odom, and he had an office above the dry goods store on Main Street. A single room with 2 chairs and a desk covered in stacked paper that had the organized disorder of someone who knew exactly where everything was, despite appearances to the contrary. He was 45 and had practiced law in Redstone County for 12 years and had spent most of those years handling land disputes, which was what practicing law in West Texas in 1882 mostly meant. He looked at the woman who came into his office with a worn cloth ledger under her arm and a carpet bag over her shoulder and a visible pregnancy and an expression of complete, steady determination, and he indicated the chair across his desk. She sat down. She opened the ledger. She began to talk. He did not interrupt her. He had learned long ago that the quality of a case was usually established in the first 10 minutes of a client talking, and interrupting good information was a habit that cost lawyers more than it saved them. She talked for 20 minutes. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the papers she had arranged on his desk, the hotel's secondary ledger pages with her annotations, the supplier invoice from Edmunds Records, Harriet Voss's list of 3 names, the land transfer documents with Iris's small vertical marks, and the pages from Brent's father's records that Brent had brought her. He was quiet for a long time. "Where did you learn to read accounts like this?" he said. "From a woman in Pittsburgh named Mrs. Garfield," Nora said, "and from 8 months of having nothing else to do but think." He picked up the supplier invoice. He read the company name. He looked at her. "This is a Texas operation." "Yes," she said. with connections to a Pennsylvania mining company. Through the agent, she said. The same agent whose name appears in the land transfer records and in the hotel's duplicate payment records. He set the invoice down. He picked up the land transfer documents. He looked at the signatures on the recording pages, the official county signatures that authorized each transfer, and his expression changed in a small and significant way. One of these signatures, he said, is from a county recorder who retired in 1880. Nora looked at him steadily. Yes. These transfers are dated 1881. Yes, she said, they are. He sat with that for a moment. A county recorder's signature on documents dated a year after that recorder's retirement was not a complicated error to explain. It was not an error at all. Mrs. Hale, he said, I need to take this to Judge Aldrich today, this afternoon, if possible. I know, she said. Monday is the deadline on Calloway's tax assessment. He was already reaching for his coat. They were at the courthouse by midday. Judge Aldrich looked at the documents for a long time without speaking, which was the judicial equivalent of Mrs. Garfield looking at a ledger for a long time without speaking, a quality of attention that was doing work even in its silence. He called for Sheriff Peck. Peck arrived, listened, looked at the forged recorder signature, and looked at Nora with the expression of a man revising a previous assessment. I'll need a deputy, he said. Take two, Judge Aldrich said. Nora walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon light. The street was ordinary and bright, and the September heat was at its full daily commitment, and around her Redstone Crossing went about its regular business, the dry goods store, the livery, the hotel where Finch's accounts now sat in the back office corrected and balanced and annotated in her small, careful hand. She stood on the courthouse steps and breathed the hot, dry air and felt the baby move and looked at the street and thought, with the clarity that comes after a very focused effort, about what came next. She heard the horse before she saw it, coming from the east end of Main Street, moving at a trot that shifted down to a walk as it entered town. A gray gelding with dust on its flanks, and a rider who had been in the saddle for a long time and was carrying that long time in the set of his shoulders and the forward lean that was barely a lean but was there. Brent Calloway pulled up at the hitching post outside the courthouse. He swung down. He was dusty from the road, and his eyes had the reddened quality of a man who had not slept properly in 2 days, and his jaw carried 2 days of growth that had not been there when she last saw him. He saw her on the courthouse steps and stopped. He looked at her standing there. He looked at the courthouse behind her. He understood something from the combination of these two facts before she said a word, in the way he understood most things, by looking at what was actually there rather than what he expected to see. You didn't wait, he said. No, she said. Where did you go? He came to the bottom of the steps. He was close enough now that she could see the specific quality of his tiredness. Not just the tiredness of the road, but the deeper kind. The kind that comes from doing something that mattered and doing it through to the end. Millhaven, he said. The county seat, 30 miles east. The records office. He reached into his coat and removed a folded document. He held it out to her. My father's original land deed. The one recorded before any transfers. The signature is from a recorder who was in office at the time. She looked at the document, then at him. I needed the original, he said. Without it, the forged transfers could be argued as subsequent legitimate sales. With it, they can't. He paused. I left before I could tell you, because I knew if I told you, you would tell me that we had enough without it. And we might have. But I wanted it to be complete. He looked past her at the courthouse door. What happened? She told him, concisely and in order. Odom, Judge Aldrich, Peck and his deputies, Hargrave's visit the previous evening, and what she had said to him and what he had said to her. Brent was very still through all of it. When she finished, he said, "He threatened you with a child." "He made implications," she said. Something in his stillness changed quality then. It became the container for something that would be very loud if the container failed. "You should have waited," he said. His voice was careful. "Not for me. Just, you should not have had to do that alone." "I know," she said. And then, because it was true, and because she was done pretending around the things that were true, "I also couldn't have done it without what you brought back. The original deed completes it. It closes the argument." She looked at the document in his hand. "You went all the way to Millhaven for something that was for me, and I walked into a lawyer's office alone for something that was for you. I think that is what this has been all along." He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was doing the thing it did in September in Texas, going golden and sideways, catching the dust in the air and making it beautiful. And in that light, his face had the open quality it had in the moments when the wall was down. The moments she had learned were not weakness, but the truest version of the strength. And he looked at her the way people look at something they have stopped trying not to look at. "Nora," he said. She heard the beginning of the thing that was in that word. And then her hand closed on his arm. Not from fear, not from the conversation they were in the middle of. Her hand closed on his arm from something entirely different, a sudden sharp reality that had nothing to do with Hargrave or courts or forged signatures or anything in the complicated world they had been navigating for the last 3 weeks. He looked down at her hand. He looked at her face. He knew. "I know," he said quietly, in the tone of someone who is immediately and completely in the present moment. "It's all right. I have the horse." The golden light held them both for one more second, the unfinished sentence still hanging in the air between them. And then they were moving, and the September afternoon continued around them in its ordinary way, indifferent and beautiful. And the courthouse steps were empty, and the street of Redstone Crossing went on with its business, and did not mark the moment, which needed no marking. Some things write themselves in a language that does not require record. The boy arrived on the 14th of November at 2:30 in the morning, 6 weeks after Nora had first stood on the platform at Redstone Crossing in her faded blue dress and learned that the life she had traveled to find was not the one waiting for her. 6 weeks was not a long time. It was, Nora had decided, exactly long enough. He came into the world in the back room of Mrs. Briggs's boarding house, in the narrow bed under the window that looked onto the vegetable garden, with the braided rug on the floor beside the bed and the candle burning low on the writing table, and Edmund's ledger still sitting where Nora had left it, closed, patient, having done what it came to do. Mrs. Briggs had sent for the midwife the moment they came through the door, and the midwife, a capable woman named Ruth Sander, who had delivered most of Redstone Crossing's population under the age of 12, arrived within 20 minutes and took charge of the room with the quiet efficiency of long practice. Brent sat outside in the hallway. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his knees up and his hat beside him, because there were no chairs in the hallway, and he had not thought to bring one, and was not going to go looking for one now, not when the alternative was sitting here where he could hear what was happening through the door. Mrs. Briggs brought him coffee at some point, and he drank it without tasting it. She brought him a second cup later, and he did not remember drinking that one either. The hours moved the way hours move when you are waiting for something that is entirely outside your ability to influence, slowly and without mercy. At 2:30, Ruth Sander opened the door. She looked at him on the floor and said nothing about the floor, because she was a practical woman who understood that people sat where they ended up when they were waiting for something this size. "A boy," she said. "Mother and child are well." Brent stood up. He stood in the doorway for a moment. The room was warm and smelled of the particular combination of effort and arrival that was unlike anything else. And in the narrow bed, Nora lay with a small wrapped bundle against her shoulder, and she was tired in the way of someone who has just finished the hardest work of her life. Her hair loose and dark against the pillow, and she looked at him in the doorway with eyes that were exhausted and clear and fully present. She held out the bundle. He crossed the room. He had not held a newborn since the day he had stood in a different room in a different life and held a child who had not lived, and that memory lived in his hands the way muscle memory lives, below thought, in the body itself. His hands knew the weight they had once held and the weight they had lost, and they came to this moment carrying that knowledge whether he wanted them to or not. But when Nora placed the child in his arms, the weight was different. It was warm and indignant and entirely present, a small, furious person who had opinions about the world already, expressing them with the full capacity of both lungs. And Brent looked down at the red, crumpled face and the absolute determination in it, and felt something shift in his chest that had not shifted in 3 years. Something that had been set in one position so long it had forgotten it could move. "Hello," he said quietly. "Hello, son." The baby stopped crying, not because of anything magical, likely because the voice was new, and the sound of something new was briefly more interesting than whatever complaint had been in progress. But he stopped and opened eyes that were the dark, unfocused blue of all newborn eyes, and seemed to consider the face above him with the gravity of someone taking a first assessment of the territory. Nora watched them. She watched the way Brent held the child, with the careful steadiness of someone who understood fragility, not as a theoretical concept, but as a thing he had learned through loss. And she watched his face in the candlelight, and she saw the thing that moved through it. The thing that was not yet named between them, but had been present since the courthouse steps. And she thought about what it meant to have come 1,800 miles to find not the life she had arranged, but the life that was apparently intended. And she found that she could not argue with the arrangement. She did not try. The news about Hargrave reached Redstone Crossing in parts, the way news in small towns reaches in parts. First the broad outline, and then the details, as they emerged from the investigation that Judge Aldrich had set in motion. Sheriff Peck and his 2 deputies had arrived at the Hargrave Ranch on Friday afternoon with a search order and had spent 3 hours in the ranch office going through records. What they found confirmed what Nora's documentation had indicated and extended it. The forged recorder signatures appeared on 7 land transfer documents over 5 years. The agent who had processed those transfers had been operating under a power of attorney that Hargrave's lawyer had drawn up, which made the chain of liability direct and documented and very difficult to argue around. Fletcher Odom came to the boarding house on Saturday morning with the preliminary findings and sat across the writing table from Nora, who was sitting up in bed with the baby asleep in the crook of one arm and Edmund's ledger open on her knee, because she had not yet been able to bring herself to put it away and was not sure she wanted to. "The tax assessment against the Calloway property," Odom said, "has been suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. Judge Aldrich signed the order this morning." He looked at his notes. "Given the evidence of manufactured assessment, it is the court's preliminary position that the debt was created artificially. Calloway will likely owe nothing." Nora looked at the ledger. She thought about Iris's 3 small vertical marks. She thought about the careful, precise woman who had seen something wrong in the margins of a document and had marked it and died before she could do anything more with what she had seen. And she thought about what it meant that the marking had survived, that the small acts of paying attention outlasted the people who performed them. "There is one more thing," Odom said. He placed a separate document on the table. "The hardware supply company that appears in your husband's ledger, the connection to the Texas operation is being forwarded to the Pennsylvania authorities. The mine inspection records from the 1882 collapse are going to be reviewed." Nora was very still. "I cannot tell you what they will find," Odom said carefully. "And I cannot tell you what the outcome will be. These things take time, and they do not always end where justice would prefer them to end." He paused. "But someone will look at those records. Because of what you brought here." After Odom left, Nora sat for a long time without moving. The baby was asleep against her shoulder, breathing with the complete trust of someone who has no reason yet to doubt that the world is a safe place. And Nora held him and looked at Edmund's closed ledger and let herself feel, fully and without management, the thing she had been carrying since February. Edmund had known. He had gone into that mine every morning knowing something was wrong with the numbers, knowing the supports were insufficient, knowing that the men who made the decisions about such things had decided that the cost of fixing them was more than the cost of the men who worked beneath them. He had written it down because he believed that writing it down made it real. He had believed, with the stubbornness of a careful man, that real things eventually mattered. He had been right. It had taken 3 years and 1,800 miles, and a dead woman's marks in a margin, and a living woman's refusal to be moved. But he had been right. She pressed her lips to the top of her son's head. Edmund Brent Calloway, who would never know his first father but would grow up knowing what his first father had done. Who would live in a house built partly on the foundation of a miner's careful notes. Outside the window, the November sky was going to the pale gold of late afternoon, and somewhere 4 miles west of town, a man was riding in from the range, and the lamp on the writing table was burning low, and the ledger was closed, and Nora Calloway sat in the last of the light and let Edmund Hale be right one final time before she put him to rest. Nora looked at the page in Edmund's ledger where his handwriting sat in its small, careful columns, the record of a man who wrote things down because he believed that if you did not write it down, it did not exist. She thought about what it meant for a thing to exist. She thought about insufficient supports, written in red ink by a man who understood something was wrong, and had recorded it in the only way available to him. A miner's ledger that had traveled 2,000 miles before the consequences finally landed. It existed. It had always existed. She closed the ledger for the last time and set it beside the candle and let it rest. Brent came that afternoon with the declaration she had been hearing in various forms since he walked into the hallway of the courthouse and looked at her on the steps. in the silences between sentences, and in the quality of his attention, and in the trip to Millhaven that he had taken because he could not stand the idea of her having to defend herself alone. He sat in the chair beside the bed. The baby was awake and doing the considering thing with the serious dark eyes, and Brent was watching the baby with the expression of a man who has discovered a new territory and intends to learn it thoroughly. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You know." "You have been wanting to ask it since the courthouse steps," she said. "You stopped because my water broke." He had the grace to look briefly caught, which was not an expression she had seen on his face before, and which she found she liked considerably. "I am not a wealthy man," he said. "The ranch is sound, but it is not large. And there are years when sound and large are not the same thing. The house needs work on the east side where the roof has a weakness that I have been meaning to address. And I have." "Brent," she said. He stopped. "Ask the question," she said. He looked at her. The candlelight in the afternoon room was soft, and the baby was doing the considering thing, and the house around them was quiet in the way of houses that have recently contained something large and are settling back into themselves. And in the quiet, his face had the open quality that was the truest version of him, the version behind the steadiness and the competence and the careful distance, the version she had been watching emerge in increments since the afternoon on the hillside. "Nora," he said, "will you stay? Not will you marry me. Will you stay?" Because he had understood somewhere along the way that what she needed first was not a ceremony, but the simple and profound offer of permanence, the offer of a place that was hers and would continue to be hers, the thing she had not had since February. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the platform at Redstone Crossing Station and the faded blue calico dress and the $5 bill on the boards, and the accumulated miles of a life that had been narrowing for months and had begun, in the last 6 weeks, to open again the way land opens after you have been in a canyon for a long time. "Yes," she said. They were married on the second Saturday of October in the small church at the end of Caldwell Street, by the same preacher who had been mopping his neck with a handkerchief on the platform the morning Nora arrived, and if he remembered the connection, he did not remark on it. Mrs. Briggs stood beside Nora. Sheriff Peck stood beside Brent. Harriet Voss sat in the front row with her hands folded and her chin elevated, and her eyes distinctly brighter than usual, which she would not have acknowledged and did not need to. Old Silas came from the livery in the vest. Fletcher Odom came because Odom had discovered over the previous 2 weeks that he liked both of these people and had decided that professional distance was overrated in a county this size. Brent placed his mother's ring on Nora's finger. It was thin and plain and had been worn smooth on the inside from years of wearing, and it fit as though it had been made for her hand, which it had not been, but which was the kind of thing you noticed on a day like this and took for what it was worth. He kissed her with the restraint of a man who is aware of an audience, and the warmth of a man who does not entirely care about the audience. And beside them, the baby in Mrs. Briggs's arms observed the proceedings with the steady blue gaze he had been developing since birth, taking the measure of the world he had arrived in, and apparently finding it acceptable. The yellow wool blanket was folded over the seat of the wagon that carried them home. Nora picked it up when she climbed in, and held it in her lap the way you hold something that has traveled with you and arrived at the place it was meant to arrive. And she ran her thumb over the mended corner where one stitch had come loose and been carefully repaired. And she thought about the woman who had knelt over it in Ohio with her needles and her love and her ordinary hope that the thing she made would reach the person who needed it. And she thought that sometimes, in ways you cannot plan or predict, ordinary hope was sufficient. On the gate post of the ranch, Brent had hung a new board. The paint was still fresh and slightly uneven in the manner of a man who is competent with most things and had done his best with this one. Calloway Family Ranch. She looked at it. She looked at the yard and the barn and the east side of the house where the roof had its weakness that needed addressing, and the garden bed along the south wall where something had been growing since summer and had gone to seed and would need to be cleared and replanted in the spring. She looked at all of it the way you look at a place you are going to know for a long time, cataloging it not for assessment, but for the pleasure of knowing, for the beginning of the intimacy of a place that is yours. She looked at the hillside behind the house where the grass was still green in November and where 2 wooden crosses stood in the afternoon light, and she thought about Iris and about Edmund and about what it meant that the people we love leave things in the world that continue after them, marks in margins, numbers in ledgers, blankets in trunks, the record of their attention and their care, and their incomplete work that others carry forward. She would plant flowers on that hillside in the spring, not because anyone asked, not because it was required, because it was right, in the way that some things are simply right and require no further explanation. The years that followed were ordinary in the way that good lives are ordinary, full of the texture of daily work and seasonal difficulty and small accumulated joy. 3 more children came, filling the rooms of the house that had needed work on the east side and then needed more rooms added when the east side was fixed and the family had outgrown what existed. The ranch grew gradually by the measure of careful work and patient accumulation, and became the kind of operation that was known in the county not for its size but for its soundness. Edmund Brent Calloway was the name they gave the boy, and he grew up with his father's quality of unhurried attention and his mother's quality of precise observation. And when he was old enough to ride, he rode with his father in the early mornings across the land that had nearly been lost and had been saved by a combination of a dead man's notes and a living woman's refusal to be moved. And he learned the land the way his father had taught him, as something that required commitment rather than possession, attention rather than dominance. Harriet Voss became, over the years, a fixture at the Calloway table on Sunday afternoons, a transformation that she managed without ever formally acknowledging that a transformation had occurred, and which everyone in the family understood was her way of showing what she could not quite bring herself to say directly. Mrs. Briggs remained at the boarding house on Caldwell Street until she was 81 years old, at which point she announced that she was tired of the business and retired to the small room at the back, which had been Nora's room, and spent her remaining years reading and drinking tea and expressing opinions about the various directions the world was taking. Douglas Hargrave left Redstone County in the spring of 1883, following the conclusion of the court proceedings that resulted in the annulment of the fraudulent land transfers and a financial judgment that absorbed most of what he had built. Where he went after that, no one in Redstone Crossing knew or particularly wanted to know. Some stories end not with drama, but with absence, and absence is sufficient. The Pennsylvania investigation into the 1882 mine collapse took 3 years and resulted in findings that confirmed what Edmund Hale had written in the 2 quiet words at the bottom of a hardware invoice. There was no criminal prosecution because the men most responsible had arranged their affairs so that responsibility lived at a remove from their names, as such men tend to arrange things. but the findings were a matter of public record. Edmund's observation was, in the end, confirmed by the official record of the thing he had witnessed. He had been right. He had written it down. It existed. On a Tuesday evening in the autumn of their 5th year at the ranch, when the children were asleep and the lamp was burning low on the kitchen table, Nora sat across from Brent with a cup of tea, and the quality of quiet that belongs to the end of a day that has been good in the unremarkable way of most good days. She was thinking about nothing in particular, which was itself a form of peace she had not been certain she would ever get back. She thought sometimes, in those quiet evenings, about the woman she had been on that platform, the woman in the faded blue dress who had bent carefully to pick up a $5 bill in front of a crowd of people who were looking away. She thought about that woman with something that was not quite pity, and not quite pride, but something that encompassed both. The tenderness you feel toward an earlier version of yourself who did not yet know how things were going to go and had to act anyway, had to bend down and pick up the money and stand back up and face what came next without the comfort of knowing there was anything worth facing it for. She had not known then. She knew now. And knowing changed nothing about the difficulty of that moment, but it changed everything about its meaning. Brent was looking at her with the expression she had come to know in the years of his expressions, the open quality that lived behind the steadiness, the version that had no wall in front of it. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She looked at him. "I was thinking about the platform," he said, "about what would have happened if I had not been there." She considered this. "You were there." "I know," he said. "I was just thinking about it." She understood the thought. She had had it herself, in various forms, at various hours over 5 years. The fragility of the sequence of events that had brought her to this kitchen, to this table, to this lamp burning low in the dark. The Tuesday when Silas's horse had been injured and Brent had been at the livery instead of out on the range. The particular morning the land agent had come to find him at the station. The way a man leans against a wall when he is waiting for something, and the way a different man would have stepped away, gone about his business, decided it was not his concern. She set her cup down. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the rough, warm hand that had carried her carpet bag down Caldwell Street on a September afternoon when she had no idea what carrying a bag could mean, and she held it the way you hold things you have learned are worth holding. "You were there," she said again. Outside, the Texas night proceeded with its enormous indifference. The stars doing their patient work above the plain, the wind moving through the grass with the sound of something that has been moving a long time and intends to continue. And in the kitchen, the lamp burned its small radius of light, and inside that light, 2 people sat with their hands together on a table. In the house they had built from the pieces of what they each had left, which had turned out to be enough. It had turned out, against all reasonable expectation, to be more than enough. In the spring, when the ground thawed and the first green came up through the soil on the hillside behind the ranch house, Nora went out in the early morning with a basket of seedlings she had started in the kitchen window all through the cold months. She knelt in the grass between the 2 wooden crosses and worked with her hands in the dark soil, pressing each small root gently into place, the way you handle things that are fragile and worth the care. Edmund Brent Calloway, who was 4 years old and had recently decided that following his mother was more interesting than following anyone else, sat in the grass nearby and watched with the grave attention that was his inheritance from both sides. Who are those for?" he asked. Nora sat back and looked at the crosses and thought about how to answer a question that had a long answer and a short one, and how to choose between them for a 4-year-old on a spring morning. "For people who mattered," she said. He considered this. "Did they know us?" "One of them knew your papa," she said, "and one of them knew me in a different way. They left things behind that helped us find each other." He turned this over with the thoroughness of someone who intends to file it away and return to it later. Then he got up from the grass and came and crouched beside her and pressed one small dirty hand into the soil next to hers. "I'll help," he said. She looked at his small, serious face and felt the thing she had felt on the platform in November, that shift in her chest, the movement of something that had been set in one position and discovered it could move. She had felt it then, looking at Brent's face in the candlelight. She felt it now, looking at her son's face in the morning sun. "Thank you," she said. They planted the flowers together, the woman and the small boy, in the grass between the crosses on the hillside behind the ranch in the spring of 1887, and the flowers came up yellow and wild and exactly right and stayed.